Thank you very much, Anka, and thank you to the interpreters. It's my great pleasure to be here. I'm going to present on behalf of both Sharon and myself. Certainly I would agree with Henrik that these are challenging times. And I think the topics that we're going to discuss at this conference have never been more relevant. The topic that Sharon and I have focused on in our presentation is really the relevance of terminology to multilingual crisis communication in large-scale transboundary crises. So hopefully it will build on some of the ideas that Henrik has also introduced now in his opening address. Just to let you know, Sharon and I have been working with colleagues on the broad topic of crisis translation for about the last 8 years or so across a number of different projects. And what I intend to do in the first part of the presentation is just to share with you some of the observations that we can make about terminology and its translation in crisis settings based on that work. So here's our first observation. As Henrik said, terminology is definitely important in achieving successful crisis communication. But I think one thing that Sharon and I would like to underline is that we shouldn't think about this communication just as happening immediately after the onset of a crisis. We would say that communication and certainly accurate and effective terminology are needed before, during, and after a crisis hits. So I think we would do well to think along a longer timeline for the contribution that terminology can make, and maybe also to shift from a response mindset to more of a preparedness mindset. This multilingual crisis communication certainly involves communication between specialists. But again, as Henrik introduced, I think communication between specialists and non-specialists is also particularly important in crisis communication. And certainly when it comes to things like campaigns for behavior change, like what we saw in COVID-19, then this communication between specialists and non-specialists is really crucial. We would also say that a crisis is not a neatly bounded domain. There are many varied areas of specialist knowledge that are required in crisis communication. And typically, again, as we've seen in COVID-19, the communicative scene is very complex. For example, in the Great East Japan earthquake in 2011, there was an earthquake and it set off a tsunami, but then that caused a nuclear disaster. And so, of course, at that time, there was regular communication needed about the earthquake, but also very suddenly, there was a lot of communication of highly specialized knowledge in the domain of nuclear contamination that needed to be communicated. And it needed to be communicated very broadly and at speed. We would also have observed that large-scale crises cross a lot of borders. So these border lines can certainly be geographic, but they can also be linguistic. They can be borders between disciplines, and they can be borders between sectors. And this can create some special challenges. Again, interestingly, Henrik isolated the example of social distancing or lockdown in his address. And these were certainly challenging terms in English. But because of the cross-border nature of multilingual crisis communication, things like social distancing started to cause confusion when they were rapidly imported, usually via the media, into other languages, where they were even more opaque and maybe even less well understood. So overall, I think what Sharon and I would like to do is argue that translators and interpreters play a significant role in supporting multilingual and multicultural communication before, during, and after crises. And certainly that terminology and the translation of terminology really need to be a part of that picture. But again, we have one kind of final big observation from our work over the last few years. And I think that's that observation is that we cannot assume that translators and interpreters will always be fully trained or experienced. And it's interesting that training came up in the poll that Henrik ran in his session. Certainly, people may be professionals in crisis communication settings, but not always. And we know from our research that so-called citizen translators play a big part too. These are people who happen to speak certain languages or belong to certain cultures, but who don't necessarily have much training or experience in translation or indeed in terminology. And these citizen translators can be very significant, especially for languages that might not sustain a well-developed professional translation market. So in this kind of overall problem space then, one of the issues that Sharon and I have been particularly interested in is training. And we addressed this training specifically as part of the project that Anka introduced when she was introducing us. This project was called Interact, the International Network on Crisis Translation. So Interact was an EU-funded research network that Sharon led and that I was a part of. It ran for 3 years from 2017 to 2020. And really, it was all about bringing together academics, NGOs, and the technology industry to try to carry out research and training on the translation that takes place in crisis settings. For one of our tasks, we carried out a survey of professional translators and citizen translators, as well as people who had used translation services in various crises around the world. What we wanted to do in the survey was find out what they thought about training and the need for training in that space. And two themes related to terminology in the context of training emerged from that survey. And the first one really was, again, the importance of getting domain-specific knowledge right in a crisis. So certainly we felt that people need to be made aware of specialized language. The second observation or finding from that survey was, again, about the need to communicate this specialized knowledge to a wide variety of people, often very different audiences with very different levels of expert knowledge, but also that the people who would be doing that kind of broad communication to many audiences may themselves not be specialists or experts. So we felt from that result that non-specialists also needed to be considered in training. So what we did was we worked together within the research network to design, to test, and to distribute a series of short online training videos. These were intended to support citizen translation projects for crisis preparedness, response, and recovery. The course was evaluated by NGOs and linguistic professionals at various points over the 3 years of the project. And we then applied this feedback in cycles to try to improve the course content. The final course that we came up with is now freely available on our Crisis Translation YouTube channel, and hopefully on the screen there you can see the URL. Essentially, the course is a kind of a 1-hour fast-track introduction to translation. It covers topics like project organization, effective writing, translation quality, but it also covers terminology. Now, the goal of such a short course is really just to sensitize citizen translators to some of the main issues to watch out for when they're translating in a crisis. For the introduction to terminology, I want to stress that it's a video of just 3 minutes. So in that very short time, we really just try to explain that both general language and specialized language can exist, and that it's important to take special care identifying and translating specialized language, because it can be easy to miss that certain words are being used in a special way in a text. We suggest to citizen translators that they should focus first on understanding the special area of knowledge that a tricky word or a set of words are being used in. And we try to advise them that they should understand the ideas kind of behind the word in that area, and then try to imagine what an appropriate word or set of words in their language or in their culture would be. And we also recommend that they should take maybe extra time on these special cases. And in the video, we link them to another short video in the course where we give them advice on how to do background research. So clearly, as you can see, the ideas that we introduce are very basic, and this is because we had to work within quite a number of restrictions. First of all, and most importantly, we had to use English, but really more accurately, plain English as a language of instruction. This is because we had no idea of the English levels or the educational background of the people who might watch the videos. And so we had to take a very simplified approach. We also couldn't include any language specific examples to help illustrate the points about translation that we were trying to make. We knew from our work with NGOs that the speakers of low resource languages would likely be viewers of these videos. So actually being able to find example text in appropriate languages would have been very difficult for us, even if we had known what languages to expect. And finally, then, we'd no real way of assessing the learning outcomes. We would have loved to have created a more interactive form of a course, and that would have allowed some sort of monitoring of learning outcome attainment and maybe included some form of self-assessment. But really, that was just beyond the scope of what we could develop in the time and in the resources available to us. So while this was certainly simplistic instruction, our goal, again, was really just to sensitize people, to raise awareness of the possibility that there could be specialized language in a crisis-related text, and to give them a little bit of a kind of a concept orientation to approaching its translation. So in that regard, we felt that this short video did what it needed to do. We have, over the years, received some positive feedback from various stakeholders since the training was launched. And really, we're looking now to the future. We're examining some questions beyond training. One question that we're often asked is, can't we just use pictograms to communicate in a crisis? Wouldn't this just eliminate any challenges, proposed by low literacy levels? In fact, Sharon has recently co-authored a chapter in a forthcoming co-edited volume on translating crisis. She worked on this with a Brazilian scholar called Adriano da Silva, and the chapter is on intersemiotic crisis translation. So it explores the issues around the use of these so-called universal images or signs for crisis and for everyday communication. Basically, it highlights the challenges in assuming that signs are universal or globally understood. And overall, findings in the area of pictograms tend to show better comprehension if signs are provided with context and or with words. And I think that gives us some interesting lessons for terminology and crisis communication. More generally, we're also trying to think about future possibilities for greater preparedness. Unfortunately, in the context of the climate emergency, I think we can expect more complex transboundary crises in the future. So as a result, I think moving to that preparedness mindset is important. Certainly some of the things that Henrik mentioned, like sharing resources or recording resources that have already been developed in pandemics, like in COVID-19 or other crises, is a good way to go forward. I also think greater collaboration between translators, terminologists, and emergency responders is another potentially fruitful avenue. And finally, I just wanted to quickly point out that our Interact collaborator from UCL, Professor Federico Federici, he's already worked on another project in Sierra Leone that trains citizen translators to translate the United Nations disaster risk reduction terminology into multiple languages there. The goal of this effort was, of course, to prepare a resource for the future, but also to reduce the impact of a kind of a monolingual mindset and to increase linguistic equality. So just in my final slide here, I want to say that we're very grateful for the opportunity to have shared our ideas. We think there could be capacity for another more detailed course to train ordinary citizens about terminology for crisis. And we'd love to hear from you if you either have a course or have any ideas for developing one. And obviously a meeting like this is a great starting point. To sign off, I think we should have been better prepared for COVID-19, but perhaps we can be better prepared for the next crisis. Thank you very much.